Well, hello everyone. It's great to be here. I'm super excited to be speaking here at Flutter and Friends. And can we quickly just give one more round of applause for all the organizers, sponsors, you all for being here, making this all possible. Let me find my clicker. Oh, is the clicker? There it is. Cool. So before I get started, before I start talking about Shorebird, I just want to quickly see where everyone's at. So can you raise your hand if you've heard of Shorebird before? Wow, OK. Way more than I expected. How about keep your hand up if you've tried Shorebird? OK, fewer people. Keep your hand up if you're using it in production. Do I see anyone? Oh, there's one right there. OK, perfect. Hopefully those numbers will go up over the next few days. But anyway, yeah, that's what I'm here to talk about. So I want to talk a little bit about code push with Flutter, thanks to Shorebird. And before I jump into that, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Felix. I started my Flutter journey back in 2018, I believe, at BMW. I was one of the engineers who was working on rebuilding the mobile app in Flutter from 2 native code bases. And then I moved on to work at Very Good Ventures, did a lot of work there on client projects, as well as started the open source team. So that's probably maybe how you know me from a lot of the open source tools. And recently I've joined Shorebird, like Lukas mentioned, and we're working on all kinds of different tools, which I'll talk about, and code push is the first one. So I personally love Flutter because I feel like it gives us developers superpowers, right? We all love Dart for the versatility, for the strongly typed language, for the JIT, AOT compilation, for hot reload, how you can target all the different platforms just with a single code base. Declarative UI, we can build our apps with widgets and kind of describe everything in a declarative way. You can communicate to native, you can communicate with native components using FFI or plugins, and the awesome developer tools make it really, really a pleasant experience as a developer. And so, as Lukas mentioned, when they first reached out and said that they're having this conference, and I found out I was speaking here, one of the first questions I asked was, do you have an app for Flutter and Friends? And they were like, oh, we don't really have too much time, so I don't think we're going to have an app for the conference. And then I was like, well, can I make you an app? Just because I thought it would be fun, I thought it would be a cool demo. And so I'm really happy to announce that it's on Google Play and the App Store. Hopefully you have it on your phone. And if you don't, you can download it. And I highly, highly encourage you to download it because not just will it help you with the conference and plan out what talks to go to and learn more about the speakers, but it will also help you actually participate in the demo later, hopefully, if everything works. So take a minute. Make sure you're on Wi-Fi if you're going to download it here, because it is a couple megs. And yeah, try to download it if you can over the next few slides so that you have it on your device. And if the QR codes don't work for you, you can just search Flutter and Friends on the App Store and Play Store. While you're downloading the app, I just want to talk a little bit about what the app kind of looks like and what you can do. So obviously, you can browse the schedule of the conference day by day. You can see who's speaking. You can learn more about the different events and activities. You can learn more about speakers and the details of the talks. You can favorite your favorite activities so that you can build kind of your own personalized schedule of things to do while you're here. You can learn more about the sponsors that help make this conference possible. And obviously, we're all developers, so you can enable dark mode if the light mode hurts your eyes and you need something more, more pleasant to look at. And so that's all great. Like, Flutter is really awesome. It helps you build these apps really quickly. I had a lot of fun building the app, but there's one small problem when it comes to building apps with Flutter, and that's, you probably know this if you're a developer, whenever you write code, you're writing bugs, basically. Like, it's really, really hard, no matter how hard you try, to build an app and have it be perfect. It's never perfect, right? Things change, like requirements. You miss things by accident if you're staying up late at night. You're rushing at the last minute. Maybe there's a lot of pressure. And so inevitably, bugs kind of creep their way in. And so I had a few bugs in this Flutter and Friends app, unfortunately. So maybe it was subconscious, but I forgot to change the Twitter logo on the talk details page to the new X logo. And so I still have the old light blue Twitter bird there. You can see it for yourself in the app if you tap on a talk. So that is something that kind of slipped through the cracks, and I was meaning to update. Didn't have time. And there's this other nasty one, which is kind of small, but it bothers me when you go into settings and you're trying to toggle light and dark mode. You probably noticed that it's inverted. So when you're in light mode, it says dark mode, and when you're in dark mode, it says light mode. It really bothers me now that I know that it's in there, and I wish that I had fixed it before I submitted it to the App Store. Um, and so a lot of times I end up feeling like when I'm building the apps, like sky's the limit, I can build whatever, it's like super great. And then it comes to submitting to the App Store, and you're kind of at the mercy of the App Store and the review process, and you don't know if it's going to get accepted or rejected. And how many of you have submitted to the App Store here? Yeah, so you probably know that it's not just as simple as submit to the App Store. You have to submit to the App Store, wait, maybe you get rejected, maybe you resubmit, and then a lot of times you're like Kermit, just praying that it's going to get approved. And actually, funny enough, I submitted 1.0 of the Flutter and Friends app 5 days ago. iOS got approved within 6 hours, and Android got approved just like midnight this morning. So it took 5 days for it to get approved because I bumped the version to 1.0. And so you really never know, but that's just part of the problem. Even if the App Store approves your app really quickly, there's still no guarantee that your users will actually update, right? Some people turn off automatic updates. And so you might work all this time to build all these awesome features and fix these bugs, and they might take months before they actually show up on a user's device. And so that's where Shorebird's code push comes in. So a little bit about Shorebird. Eric started Shorebird pretty recently, and I joined him, and we're now a team of 4. And we're working on solving some of these gaps that exist in the Flutter ecosystem that maybe other companies aren't incentivized to fill. And we wanted to start with code push because you probably know out of the 85,000 issues on Flutter, code push is the #1 open issue right now. And I believe Eric mentioned it was like 25 on the top, like all-time GitHub issues is code push for Flutter. And so we thought that was a great problem to start with because it's clear people want it, people need it. These problems that I mentioned that I experienced while building the Flutter and Friends app are real problems that developers face all over. And so for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with code push, I just kind of want to explain a little bit what it is. You can think of it as a Flutter developer, you can think of it as hot restart in production. So basically you can make changes to your Dart code, and then you can deliver those updates over the air instantly to users' devices. So you're not waiting for App Store reviews, you're not waiting for people to update their app. You're in more control, kind of like what the web does, where every time you ship a new change, your users get the latest version. With Shorebird, we have seamless integration so that one of our goals was that you don't really have to change any code in your code base to add Shorebird. It's a drop-in replacement, so it's kind of like a build step rather than an integration. And it's free to try, so I encourage you to try it later. You can check it out at shorebird.dev. And so now that we kind of have talked about this hot restart in production, and we saw some of those bugs that made it through in the Flutter and Friends app, you're probably thinking like, okay, Felix, can you show me? Like, let's see you fix these bugs in production. And I will try that, but before I try that, I want to kind of talk through what I've done before this conference, leading up to this. So while I was building the Flutter and Friends app, the first thing I did was I visited console.shorebird.dev. I've followed the instructions and installed the Shorebird CLI. And then I've run one command, which is shorebird init. And all that does is just tell the Shorebird backend, hey, this app exists. The backend assigns you, your app, a unique ID. And that's it. And then I built the app, and when I was ready to submit to the Play Store and the App Store, I ran 2 commands. I ran shorebird release Android, and I ran shorebird release iOS alpha. And those commands basically generate the same thing as when you run a Flutter build IPA or a Flutter build app bundle. And so I took the output of those commands and submitted it to Google Play and the App Store. And so that's where we are today. A little bit more about like what this initialization process looks like. It's just one command. Shorebird will kind of detect, do you have flavors set up in your project? What's the name of your project? You can customize a couple of things. And then really at the end of the day, it just generates a single file in your project called a shorebird.yaml. And really the important thing is just the app ID. And again, that's not a secret. It's not something that you need to keep private. It's just a unique ID that tells Shorebird servers, hey, this is Flutter and Friends. This is how you uniquely identify the Flutter and Friends app. The only other thing I changed for this particular app is I've disabled auto updates. But by default, auto update is enabled with Shorebird. And so that means you don't have to do anything. You just build with Shorebird. And whenever users launch your app, Shorebird will check in the background, is there an update available? If so, it'll download the update. And then the next time the user launches the app, it'll boot up from the update. For the sake of Flutter and Friends, I wanted to customize that experience, which you'll probably see. And so I disabled auto updates, and I'm using a package on pub.dev that we published called Shorebird Code Push. And that lets you communicate with Shorebird and customize how updates are delivered and how often you're checking for updates and that type of thing. So all of that is completely optional, though. By default, it will just work without you making any changes to your code base. And the last thing is, in the console, this is kind of what I saw right before coming here. So I have a single app called Flutter and Friends. It's version 1.0. You can kind of see there's no patches. That's that little puzzle piece that says none next to it. And then if I click into it, I have a bunch of releases. So you can see some of the releases only made it to Android because Google Play reviewed them really quickly. Then some of them only made it to iOS because iOS, the App Store reviewed them quickly. But the important thing is, this morning, we all have 1.0. So hopefully, if you have it installed on your device, you can check in the settings that you're running version 1.0 of the app, because that's pretty important for the demo. So now, the fun part is we try to fix the issues that I mentioned. So let me pull up VS Code, and let me know if it's too small. Looks good? So the first thing I want to do is just quickly talk about the code base. So it's just a basic Flutter project, nothing special. A bunch of code in the lib directory organized by just different features. So we kind of have like talk details, schedule, workshop details, some theming, favorites, nothing too crazy. We have the shorebird.yaml file that I mentioned that Shorebird generated when I ran the init command. And that's pretty much it. It's just a vanilla code base that you can look up. It's open source on GitHub. And so let's go and see if we can fix some of these issues. So the first issue was in the details page of a talk. We have, let me get rid of my terminal. We have a, if the speaker has a Twitter handle, we want to render a Twitter icon button. And this Twitter icon button is rendering a Twitter icon. And I even left myself a nice little fix me that we should use the X icon instead. And I even conveniently have a widget called X icon down here. I just forgot to swap them out. But really, it's just instead of this light blue accent with the old Twitter bird icon, there's a black background with the X logo. Nothing too crazy. So I'm going to quickly just address that first issue and update the icon. The next one was that pesky settings. So on the settings page, we have the theme toggle. And the theme toggle has a nice fix me that says something's not right here. And that's because when we're in light mode, it should probably say light mode. And when we're in dark mode, it should say dark mode. And the icons should also reflect that probably. So let's fix that. And actually, this morning, this was unplanned, but I noticed 2 more problems that were bugging me that I was like, we might as well try to fix those as well. So if you haven't added any favorites on the favorites screen, you'll probably see a message that says, tap a heart icon to add a talk to your favorites. But that's not necessarily true. You can add an activity. You can add a workshop. So I thought maybe this should be a little more generic, and we can say to add an event to your favorites. And the last thing, which is kind of embarrassing, is on the settings screen, there's a link to follow on X, the Flutter and Friends account. And that accidentally leads you to shorebird.dev. Not intentional. I did not mean to do that. And so that should be the Flutter and Friends Twitter link. So you can check all of these bugs should be on the build that you're running right now. You can verify that it's definitely like this is linking you to Shorebird. The settings are in this weird state where it tells you the wrong theme. The Twitter icon is the old icon. All these are problems that are an issue on the current build if you're running 1.0. And so now that I've fixed all of these issues, you can see I've just made a bunch of Dart changes. I can just run Shorebird patch. I'll do iOS first. And this is going, first it's going to tell you in bold that iOS is an alpha. So I'm going to talk more about why iOS is an alpha. But just know that Android is stable and iOS is an alpha. So it's not for everyone. Hopefully it will be stable very soon. But next what it does is it's going to build a release. So this is going to basically do like a Flutter build IPA, which can take a second. It will also do some other things. On Android, we do diffing. So we'll pull down the release that you uploaded, and then we'll make a release of the current patches, and then we'll do the diff so that we only upload what's changed. On iOS, we don't do that yet, so the patches are quite big, but those will also hopefully get smaller. And we do some other checks that I'll talk about. But yeah, this one command will basically create the patch and then upload it to Shorebird servers and make it available to your devices. So how many people are running on iOS? Oh, wow. OK, majority are running on iOS. OK, so it's good that I'm doing iOS first. So once this is done building, hopefully in a few seconds, I will send a notification to all of your devices. So you should see a little banner at the top of the app that says an update is available. And again, make sure you're connected to Wi-Fi so that you don't waste data on a pretty big patch for iOS if you're following along with the demo. And also, while that's building, I'm going to pull up my iPhone and my Android device so that we can follow along as well. So these are my devices. And let's move this over. And of course, it's taking quite a long time. Unfortunately, this project does have Firebase added to it, which takes a little bit longer when you do the build. Hopefully not too much longer. And Android should be, hopefully, a decent amount faster. If it takes more than a couple more seconds, I'll just keep going through the slides so that we don't waste too much more time watching it build. But yeah, the other thing that you can do with this is when you're using Shorebird, you don't have to use it to push patches to releases that are uploaded to Google Play in the App Store. You can also preview things locally. So if you want to distribute via test flight, or just if you're sharing an APK with someone, you can also use the same exact approach and share updates to people. It doesn't have to just be distributed through the App Store. Shorebird doesn't really care. You can see really quick, I want to call your attention to the size of the update for iOS, 6.5 megabytes. That's really, really big, and we're working on getting that down. But again, that's because we're not diffing anything on iOS. OK, so iOS we've patched. So I have this super secret script to push a notification to iOS. So if you're running on an iOS device, as I am here, we should have received the notification and be downloading the app. And we do now see a little banner that says an update is available. So if you're following along. So if I tap on the restart now, we should have booted from the update. So all the changes that I made. And so I can tap. And I do see now the Twitter logo is no longer there. It's the X icon. If I go to settings, I see now it does correctly say light mode instead of dark mode when I'm toggling. You can also see a number 3, which I didn't call your attention to, next to the version of the app. That means that it's running patch number 3 for that release. Previously, you were probably running patch number 2. So that's another way to know that you've downloaded the patch. And oh yeah, and we should check to make sure that follow on X takes you to the Flutter and Friends Twitter account, which it looks like it does. So we've fixed all those issues on iOS. I'm going to run the same command for Android. And yeah, I guess while that goes, I'm not going to wait for that one. We'll go back to the slides, and we'll check on that in a few seconds. And hopefully, that one will be quicker than than iOS. So, quick recap. Basically, if you aren't following along on your device, like you saw on mine, you should see an update when you've pushed for the Flutter and Friends app a new patch. That happens because of a silent push notification that is being sent to the device. That tells your phone, hey, there's a patch available. I'm going to go download it. And then once it's ready, you see the little material banner that says, do you want to restart and launch from the patch? A couple things that Shorebird does in addition is it verifies hashes of patches. So when you create a patch and upload it to our server, you're also sending a hash, like a checksum for that patch. And before Shorebird actually applies those patches on a device, it verifies to make sure that those hashes match. So it does some integrity checking. It also will automatically roll back to a previous patch if you accidentally push some code that crashes your app. So Shorebird will detect that, oh, hey, this is a bad patch. It caused a crash. Let's roll back to the previous working version so that we don't make the user experience any worse than when you didn't have Shorebird. So we really want to do no harm whenever possible with Shorebird. And as you saw with Flutter and Friends, we do have Shorebird working now on iOS and Android. Which is great. That wasn't the case when Eric gave his talk at FlutterCon Berlin. which is super awesome. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that we currently have that are either done or in progress, just so that everyone knows the current state of things. So Android is stable, like I mentioned. It runs at near native performance. iOS is in alpha, which I'll talk a little bit more about. We do support flavors. We do support add to app. So if you're adding Flutter to a native application, you can still use Shorebird to push updates to the Flutter pieces, which is super cool. And for both the flavors and add to app, we have guides on how to do that at our docs site, which is docs.shorebird.dev. We do have CI integration as well. So if you don't want to run commands manually, like I did, you can use GitHub Actions and CodeMagic. We currently support, but we're happy to add more as people need them. And we also support multiple versions. So Shorebird supports switching dynamically across multiple Flutter versions. If maybe one project is using Flutter 3.10 and another one is using 3.13, Shorebird supports that. One thing that we're currently working on that it doesn't support is assets. So if you want to update assets in a patch, maybe you want to update a font or you want to add a new image or something else, Shorebird currently does not support that. It'll actually warn you if it detects that you've changed assets. It'll also warn you if it detects that you've changed native code so that you don't accidentally push a patch that won't work. But we're working on asset support, and that should be coming very soon. Now, some limitations. It's not all good news. There's some things that you should be aware of. So in particular, iOS runs approximately 100 times slower with Shorebird than without Shorebird. And you can kind of see that in the Flutter and Friends app. This is just the Dart code, by the way. So the Dart code runs 100 times slower. So if you scroll really fast in the iOS app on Flutter and Friends, you can notice that it stutters a little bit. It's not like a super buttery smooth experience. And that's because the code is 100% running in this interpreted mode, which I'll talk more about. And we're working on improving that so that iOS is just like Android and runs at near native performance. But that's one of the biggest reasons why iOS is still in alpha. And so before you add it to your iOS app, do some benchmarks, see if it works well for you. Depending on the app that you're adding Shorebird to, it might not be noticeable. But on apps that are really heavy with animations and lots of interactive experiences, you'll probably notice that it's quite slow. Also, the patch sizes, as I mentioned, are large because we're not diffing. Another thing to note is if you need Flutter versions older than 3.10, we currently don't support older Flutter versions, but we're happy to add support as people need them. It was more of just like a prioritize the most important thing. And so we're currently supporting the latest stable version almost as soon as it comes out within a few hours. And we go back to 3.10. And we're also only focusing on mobile. So if you need desktop, we have an issue open that you can upvote if you're interested in desktop support. That is something that we'll eventually add. So now I want to talk about how Shorebird works. But first, let's check on Android, because we don't want to leave Android hanging. So Android built. Again, you can see this warning that artifacts contain some changes. In this case, I'm OK with that, because I know that the app has everything it needs. And that looks like that went through. So let's push Android. Oh, let's push Android. Oh, no. Of course, we didn't update the permissions. And now let's push Android. No? Oh, did I do capital X? Thank you. This is why I love having developers. Thank you, thank you. OK, so now let me pull up. My Android device went to sleep. Hopefully, it's still connected to the network. So it should have received the notification and be downloading the patch in the background, maybe. I don't know if I'm even connected anymore. Someone give me a thumbs up if you're seeing an update on Android. Nothing yet? It's there? OK, so maybe my device is just not connected. The other thing you can do, this is a cheat, is if you tap on the version, you will force the app to check for an update. So if you don't see it, you can always prompt it to check by tapping on the version. So there we go. We've updated it. I can double check on Android now. We've updated the Twitter logo to the X logo, and light mode and dark mode seems to be working. And what was the last one? The Twitter link seems to be working. So great. We're working on Android and iOS, which is awesome. So now back to how Shorebird works. So when you install the Shorebird CLI, it pulls down a custom version of Flutter with it. And that custom version of Flutter includes a custom Flutter engine. And that custom Flutter engine includes the Shorebird updater, which is a component that's written in Rust, and that's the thing that knows how to check for updates and apply updates to your app. So you'll probably notice if you install the Shorebird CLI that it pulls down its own Flutter, and that's part of the reason why we've kind of not gone all the way back in time to every old Flutter version, because you can imagine that takes a lot of time and effort. But that's just how it works at the moment. I'll explain a little bit more about why. It also has a custom Dart compiler and Dart interpreter so that it can comply with App Store policies, which I'll also talk about. And then the other big component is the backend. So the Shorebird backend, all it's there for is just to host the binaries. So we never see your source code when you're using Shorebird. It's only the uploaded artifacts, so the things that you would normally share with the Play Store or the App Store. And there's this optional package, Shorebird Code Push, which I mentioned, which I'll also talk about a little bit more, but that's for advanced usage. And so this is just a high-level visualization of all these different components. Again, we have the backend. The CLI talks to the backend and uploads patches and releases. We have our Flutter version, which has our Flutter revision, which has its own Flutter engine, updater, and then Dart. And the reason for us doing it this way is so that at the end of the day, you can use Shorebird as a drop-in replacement for Flutter. So instead of running Flutter build app bundle or Flutter build IPA, you just run Shorebird release Android, Shorebird release iOS, and you don't have to change anything else. It's just a single build step. If you're running that in your CI, you change it in your CI. If you're running it locally, you just type that command instead, and you don't make any other changes to your project. You don't need to add a dependency to your pub spec. You don't need to annotate your code or do anything crazy. We wanted it to be as simple as possible to integrate. And with the Shorebird Code Push package, you're in control of the update experience. So you can do things like check if there's a current patch installed, so that like in the Flutter and Friends app, you can surface the current patch that's running for your end users. You can check if there's a new patch available to download. You can download the new patch. All this stuff that you want to have low-level control over, you can do with the Code Push package. But if you also don't care and you just want the app to update whenever the user launches it and do its own thing, you don't have to do any of this. You can just add Shorebird and then not think about it, which is super nice. I also wanted to share just a quick snippet of what the CI integration looks like. So if you've used Firebase, you're probably familiar with logging in this CI mode. So similarly with Shorebird, you can log in with the CI mode, go through the OAuth flow, and then it spits out a CI token, and then you can add that as a secret to your GitHub repo or whatever. And we have this convenient GitHub action called setup Shorebird, which handles installing Shorebird and setting it up in your CI environment so that you can just run commands directly from your GitHub workflow so that you can do patches and releases in an automated way. And the big one, so everyone always asks, is it safe for stores? And the answer is yes. The way we've built it is intended to comply with App Store policies. So the Play Store has restrictions that apply unless you're running in a virtual machine or an interpreter, and Shorebird uses the Dart virtual machine. And on the App Store, you can interpret code, which is why we have a custom Dart interpreter that Kevin is working hard on optimizing. And all of this is so that we can comply with App Store guidelines and also deliver high performance eventually. I realize iOS is still not high performance, but that's, again, because it's running in this 100% interpreted mode. In the future, we want it to run in this mixed mode where code that hasn't been modified runs just like it would natively, and then only code that you've patched is interpreted so that you get that near native performance. With all that said, there's never been a better time to try Shorebird. We recently just upped all of the specs of all the different tiers. So with the free tier, where you don't have to put any credit card info in or anything, you get unlimited apps, and you can sign up for an account, and you get 5,000 patch installs every month. And one question that people always ask is, what is a patch install? And that's just one patch is delivered to one device. So we wanted it to be charged based on usage and not based on team seats or things like that. And so if Shorebird provides a lot of value to you, then obviously we're providing value, so then it's worth paying for. But if you're not really patching that many users, like for example, Flutter and Friends, I can get away with the free tier because we don't have over 5,000 patch installs every month. So yeah, and if you want custom pricing, you can contact us. We're more than happy to talk to you. If you have an app that, for example, has over 1 million users, we're more than happy to figure out a price that makes sense for you all. And pricing is not intended to be a blocker for Shorebird. If anything, we want it to be as accessible as possible. And so hopefully this talk kind of showed you why you might want to use Shorebird and what Shorebird has to offer and how it kind of looks to use Shorebird in the wild. But if you are curious to see, like, how can I actually add this to my app? How can I go more in depth on trying this out for myself and seeing if it works well for the apps that I'm working on and my users? I highly encourage you to check out the workshop tomorrow, where that's exactly what we'll be doing. We'll just be going in depth on adding Shorebird to an existing app. And you can bring your own app, or you can follow along with an example. Totally up to you. But at the end of that, you should leave with Shorebird fully integrated into an app of your choice, which is pretty cool. And there'll also be swag. So if you want to come by and get some swag, it's always a good time. The last thing that I want to mention is one of the really cool things about working at Shorebird is the way that we work, and that's just entirely in the open. Almost all the code is open source, with the exception of the backend and the Dart SDK, which we'll probably open source at some point. And we do everything in the open in terms of like stand-up updates. We talk amongst ourselves as engineers publicly on Discord. We answer community questions publicly on Discord. So if you want to learn about what we're doing, what everyone's working on, and get your questions answered, definitely check out discord.gg/Shorebird. And we also use Twitter to kind of communicate updates and releases. So if you want to follow along, you can follow us on Twitter/X at shorebird.dev. And with that, that's all I have. So I really appreciate everyone coming out, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for a great talk, Felix.
Thank you.
And now on to some questions. Are you ready?
Yes, hopefully.
So first one is from Thomas. Could you elaborate a bit on the up to 10 times slowdown for Shorebird apps on iOS? Has that improved, and what's the expectation/time frame for future improvements?
So I don't want to make it sound bad, but it's actually 100 times, not 10 times. And the reason for that, that's based on a benchmark that Kevin ran, the Dart team uses. I think it's called Richards. Basically, that's just because, like I mentioned, all the Dart code that is running in your iOS app when you add Shorebird runs in our Dart interpreter, regardless of if you've changed it or not, regardless of if it's the release or the patch. And so that leads to the 100x slowdown. That is the #1 priority. That is what Kevin is working on every single day to fix. And I think we're getting close. I think Eric was estimating probably next month we'll have a big update on iOS, and hopefully we'll be able to announce a stable. But yeah, it's coming very soon. That's our #1 priority.
Nice. I hope they are happy with that answer. From Anonymous, will code push help pushing native lib components like dylib.so, etc.?
Yeah, you cannot update native code with code push. That's one of the limitations. So if you want to make native changes and you have Shorebird in your app, you have to create a new release. So assets is another one that you have to create a new release, but we're working on fixing assets. I don't think native code is something that we'll be able to address. So any native changes, like if you're adding a plugin or adding libraries, you'll have to create a new release. So that's something to keep in mind.
All right, so yes. I can repeat the question for the stream. So even if you package the dylib as an asset, would that be possible?
Then that should work once we add asset support, but that's still currently not supported. It is something that we're working on, and it will be available somewhat soon. So there's an issue open again. With everything with Shorebird related, if there's something that you really need and there's not an issue, please open one. And if there is, just give it a like, and that will help us prioritize. Because at this point, we're working on what our customers really, really need. And so if asset support is super important to you, we will make that a higher priority. But that's already pretty high on our priority list.
All right, and a question from Albert. Does reverting an update on Android also use their update diff mechanism, or are we downloading the whole app for the rollback?
Oh no, the rollback just rolls back to the previous. So Shorebird maintains the most recent known healthy patch, and then the one that you're trying to boot from. And so you're not reinstalling a whole new release. And also, we never remove the original release from the App Store. And so you always have a fallback, which is the original app that the users downloaded from the App Store. So they're not going to have to re-download a whole new binary.
Makes sense. This is a good question. What can go wrong, and what is the worst thing that can happen?
That's a great question.
During code push?
The absolute worst thing that could happen is you push a patch that causes a crash for whatever reason. Maybe you ignore Shorebird's warnings and you use the -- force flag and you make some native changes or you rely on some asset being there and your app crashes, what will happen is your user will install that update, try to boot from it, the app will crash. Shorebird will see that it crashed, it will mark that patch as bad, and then the next time the user launches the app, it will launch from the previous healthy state. So the worst case is one crash and then back to the previous. And that's if you ignore Shorebird's warnings and you force push, or if we have some bug that we're not aware of. iOS probably has some known crashers still, which is another reason why it's an alpha. We fixed many of them actually in the process of releasing Flutter and Friends, which is another good reason to do it. So Android is really, really stable, whereas iOS, there are still areas that we're unsure of if they're fully stable. Like we're really working through all those issues on iOS right now. So definitely use iOS at your own risk. I would not add it to like a 1 million user user app at the moment. Just try it out and get a feel for it, and hopefully we'll have a stable release soon.
All right. I think we have a lot of questions here, but I think this will be the second last one. From Chagatai, can you send updates for only some countries?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Currently, we don't support having like a percentage rollout or target audiences, but that is something that we have the infrastructure to support. We just haven't prioritized it yet. So if that's something that's like a blocker for you to adopt Shorebird, definitely, again, let us know. I think there's an issue already open for that, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not available yet, but it's something that we've thought about. And we're only a 4-person team, so we're trying to prioritize things that people really, really want. So we'll get to it, but not at the moment.
All right, thanks. Last question from Thomas. What does near native performance mean more specifically?
Yeah, so it means that most of the time you won't notice any difference. It will, if you've downloaded the app on Android, for example, I'm sure you probably can't tell a difference between an app with Shorebird and an app without Shorebird. That being said, if you decide, for example, you want to push a patch that rewrites your entire app, which you probably shouldn't do because then you'll probably get rejected by the App Store. But in theory, if you change the entire app and pushed it as a patch, then you will not have native performance anymore because you'll kind of be back in the original boat of everything is being interpreted on iOS. And so near native performance just means if you're using Shorebird to patch things like critical bug fixes and small improvements like what we've done in the demo here, your users won't be able to tell a difference. But if you're changing everything, then you'll have to kind of pay the same price. And one thing on the previous question that I just thought of that I wanted to go back to is you can achieve that percentage-based rollout yourself if you want to, using the Shorebird code push package and your own backend if you wanted to, because you have all the information available to you about is there a patch available, who is the user, presumably you know that information, and so you can kind of build that infrastructure yourself, but that is something we'll probably also support for you, like out of the box.
Right, but if it's super critical for you, it's not completely blocking you if you're a big company. Yes, the comment on here. Crazy idea. Thanks, Felix. Thanks, Shorebird. And with that, let's give a big round of applause for Felix.